The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, folks. We're going to be starting here in just a few minutes. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about all these wonderful things that are going on at the Postal Service. So while you're all getting settled, bringing in your lunch and adult beverages, we'll be waiting here for a couple more minutes, and we'll be starting at 1 Eastern or maybe a minute thereafter. Okay, talk to you soon. Well, good afternoon again, folks. Welcome to this afternoon's Mailers Hub webinar. We're a little bit out of our usual Tuesday per month cycle, but we're talking about some important things today that will probably be worth covering as a special webinar. The service standard changes and pricing changes that are being proposed or have been proposed by the Postal Service. We're going to be covering a little bit of background about the Postal Service, then going to the 10-year plan, the premises of the plan, and of course the two things we just talked about, which are sort of the principal elements of the plan. Yeah, go ahead here. Go ahead to the next slide here. We also have to go over the finances and show you how things are so far this year. Volume through April. The May numbers won't be out for another week or so, but volume so far was up. But that's not because first class and marketing mail are doing awesome. It's because of packages. As you can see, the numbers for first class and marketing suggest a sharp increase, but that's because all these are compared to 2020. So we're comparing to the year, in fact, April of last year when things really went into the toilet. So it's sort of an unfair comparison because any increase would look good compared to that. Just the same for year to date, which is probably a little bit more reliable. You can see how first class and marketing mail are not quite caught up to where they should be for the year to date. And again, the year that we're talking about here in this case is October through September. Revenue looks good, but again, because packages gave a lot of money to the Postal Service last year. When the pandemic hit, nobody went shopping in the stores. A lot of online activity started. So everybody in the package business, UPS, FedEx, Postal Service, everybody got a lot of new volume. But what's happening now is, as you can see in that little red number, things are starting to slow down a little bit. The boom is not what it was. And compared to last year, competitive products aren't quite growing as much. So the bottom section talks about revenue. You can see similar patterns there. The overarching themes, however, are that expenses and work hours are still exceeding plan levels. Costs continue to outrun income, and the Postal Service is having to continue. It has continuing struggles to deal with that. Revenue for the year. At the end of April, there was a net loss of $683 million, but still better than last year. And for the year to date, it's still $6 billion about better than it was at fiscal 2020. So in the next slide, we can talk about service. And service obviously was hurt by the pandemic. You had a lot of absenteeism. You had a significant loss of air transportation capacity, and you had congestion of the plants. You had they simply lost the ball in terms of operating plans and first in, first out and whatnot. Packaging or package volume rather, what was a big impact as well. The plants were just jammed with packages. You can have 50 million letters in a plant, perhaps, and they're relatively small, so they may hide themselves in all the machines and on trays and whatnot. But 5 million or 5,000 packages are another matter altogether. In the red oval down there, you can see how the quarterly numbers at the end of Q2, which was the end of March, were really not good. And the worst ones were for first class, were in the 3 to 5 day area, which was only 74%. And
Good afternoon, everyone. I know we've lost some audio here. We've got Leo calling back in on his phone. He'll be back on the line in just a minute.
hello.
And we hear you now, Leo. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Okay, you're there.
Yes.
Is everybody back? Everybody's been there, and I haven't been. Okay. Now my screen is still frozen. So what slide do you want here?
So you were just getting to the end of the background of service performance with the red circle at the bottom.
Okay. Can you move to the next slide? But I can't see it now. I have to get back in, I think.
All right. You're now on the 10-year plan premises.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Hang on. Let me try to get this taken care of here. Sorry for all this delay, folks. This is a little technical glitch on our end. And as soon as I can actually know what I'm talking about here and see my slides, we'll be in business. Let's see. Already running. Okay. All right. Okay. So the premise of the plan. All right. The premise obviously was that the Postal Service had an unsustainable business model, as you can see, which in some ways is very true. There's inadequate funding, and it has a variety of mandates that make the whole financial picture sort of lopsided. You've got the universal service mandate, which assumed there would always be a certain amount of volume in order to cover the cost of the system, but that equation is no longer as good as it once was, simply because there is less mail involved now than there once was. So the funding from ratepayers is not adequate to cover the continuing costs of the model of the obligation. So costs are outrunning revenues. Losses continue to increase, and of course, one of the predicates for the 10-year plan was the 10-year projection of $160 billion, and that's been sort of a bogey out there ever since the plan was introduced. And there were some complaints about the business situation and how operations are no longer what they're supposed to do. They're not able to do what they're supposed to do because of the changes in the mail mix. So on the next slide, we can talk about more about this. And the issues that led to its development: declining volume of traditional mail, and of course, growth in packages. And as we discussed before, if you've got a lot of packages, those are different than, much different to handle, much different to move than the physically smaller and much more numerous letters and flats for which the system was designed. So you've got a real incompatibility there. But there are other issues behind this, which we'll cover shortly. So going on to the next slide. Okay, on the next slide, we can see how this is a service pattern that was in place in 2020 in postal quarter 2 at the end of March. So this is from the newsletter from Mailer Sub News, and you can see how there are some situations where the overnight, 2-day, and 3-day standards, which are in the left center, were exceeded because you had some really good service performance. And the black boxes, you can't really read the numbers here, I apologize. The black boxes on the right center were mostly for standard mail or marketing mail flats, and that's been a chronic problem. In the next slide, however, which covers fiscal 21, a year later, you can see how the black boxes virtually swamp the whole chart. And again, this was in the newsletter last, I believe it was in April, when the second quarter data came out. And because those black boxes are so predominant in the 3- and 5-day category of first class, you can see that was where the problems were, because again, transportation wasn't working. Now, going on to the next slide, we can see how this led to what I think is reasonable to call a premature conclusion, that because of the terrible situation in which the Postal Service was operating, with reduced capacity by air, fewer people to move the mail, that the service standards that were in place were unattainable, and that the only way to get anything done to reach a service standard was to move more mail by surface, get it out of the air, and make the service commitments easier to reach. So the charts you see on the screen there are from the plan that came out in March, and they significantly reduced the amount of mail that's going to be moved by air, because there are still some places like Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico you can't really drive to, and those are going to still be moved by air. But for the most part, you're going to have a lot more surface transportation, and that's going to have the impact shown in the left-hand graph, where you're going to have 3-day being broken up into 3-day, 4-day, and 5-day. There's actually a 6-day commitment for offshore. Next slide shows some comments from the plan, and some of these are things that you're going to see used very commonly in some of the Postal Service's publicity: cost and inefficiency, reliance on air transportation, and low utilization of truck capacity. You've got all consistency and reliability, for example, are buzzwords. They don't talk about what quality of service is going to be delivered, just to whether it's consistent or reliable. And there's a big difference. We'll talk about that. So this, again, these are statements out of the plan that support the idea of moving more mail by surface, because surface at the time was proven to be unreliable. Next slide shows, again, another interpretation of how they're going to do this. They're going to change the bullseye and move some mail that is really not very far away from where it's originating into a higher day standard. Going on to the next slide, we have some examples of how that is going to be played out in real life. Mail moving from Boston to Albany, this is the Northeast, obviously, or Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, or from New Haven to Philly, those are going to now become a 3-day standard, even though I think all of us could probably navigate that distance in a little over a couple hours, maybe 3 hours. So a 3-hour drive now becomes a 3-day standard. Going on to the next slide, you can see how that plays out in the Midwest, just going across the state of Michigan, Detroit to Grand Rapids, or within Ohio, from Cleveland to Columbus, or from Chicago just down into Indiana, Indianapolis. These are not great long distances, but still, this is going to be used. These distances now will become a 3-day service standard in the Postal Service's plan. Next slide shows you how things are going to look In Texas, again, not very far. Intrastate movements or Dallas to Shreveport, not very far. All those become 3 days now, even though right now they're a 2-day standard. Next slide shows how we're going to have some 4-day standards going from Milwaukee to Denver, or Atlanta to Hartford, or Dallas to Jacksonville, or on the West Coast, from Portland down to Los Angeles. These are drives that you could probably make in a couple of days, but now they're going to become a 4-day standard, and that's going to mean an additional day each way for the mail. And the last slide, again, shows how a 5-day standard becomes manifest, going at greater distances, not even all the way across the country, Sacramento to St. Louis, Buffalo to Salt Lake City, Houston to Portland, and so forth. So you're not going much farther than probably a 3-hour, 3.5-hour flight, 4-hour flight, but you're now moving it to a 5-day standard because of how much more mail is going to be driven those distances than would be flown currently. So on the next slide, you can see how the plan involves moving mail more slowly, but through more stops. So the idea being to put more and more mail on a truck by driving to different places to exchange mail from other origins, to fill up the truck, to go to the next place to do more swaps. So you have fewer trips in total, but you're going to have more mail on those trips. Well, that may be great for making sure the trip is full, making sure the truck is full. But if you're going to spend all that time driving and exchanging and transferring, that's going to slow down the time it takes, or the time consumed to go from A to B, and in turn, it's going to make your service standard necessarily a day longer. So on to the next slide. Notwithstanding what the Postal Service may claim, there's a very marginal benefit to the Postal Service financially. Their testimony says they're going to save less than $175 million on an annual basis. And what that represents is less than 0.1% of the Postal Service's total transportation costs, which is $8.8 billion. So you're not saving gazillions of dollars here. There was somebody made a comment once years ago when looking at numbers the size of 175 million, that in the Postal Service's context, it's a rounding error. Well, it may not be a rounding error, but it sure isn't the kind of savings that you'd expect in exchange for this impact on customers. You're going to have longer transit times each way, longer going to the customer, longer time coming back from the customer if it's a payment. You're going to have, therefore, these delays in remittances. You're going to have challenges meeting service level agreements. You're going to have some legal requirements that may apply to some financial companies that could be impacted. You're going to have serious disruptions to billing operations and to the costs that are absorbed by the companies who advance you credit, for example. So all of this constitutes a lesser value for the mail and an incentive to move more outside the mail, is to divert that volume someplace else. So that's not good, of course, for the Postal Service or for the companies who depend upon the mail for a livelihood. So going on to the next slide, we'll look at the process that's underway here and figure out where this is going to end up. Well, the process has been chugging along since April. The Postal Service filed testimony from witnesses and different people have filed questions, interrogatories. So the opinion from the commission is due in about a month, and that is an advisory opinion. The Postal Service is not bound by it. So as you can see, they were quite clear in their intentions when they said it's seeking this opinion because it intends to implement the proposed service standard changes. Mailers Hub was an intervener in the case. We are an intervener in the case. We asked questions of the witnesses, and it was pretty clear from the answers we got that the Postal Service has no intention of doing anything other than what it's already said it was going to do. It's going to go forward with this within 90 days of its filing. So probably, well, it said no earlier than September 1st, but probably pretty close to the date thereafter. Going on to the next slide, here are some of the questions that I think are appropriately asked about this. Consistent, reliable service. In whose mind? They constantly talk about what customers, recipients expect or will accept, but they don't really say an awful lot about what ratepayers want. If you ask, Mrs. Smith what she's going to think about getting her Visa bill a day later, she may not care. But I think if you ask the people, the bank issued the visa, they may have a way different answer because the expectations of the recipients and the expectations of senders, people who pay the bill, are significantly different. So is all of this worthwhile? What's it going to do to volume? I disagree with the Postal Service's conclusion that the cost-benefit analysis still comes out in their benefit. They think they're going to lose some mail, but they're going to save money, save more money to offset that loss. Well, that's an equation that they may be satisfied with, but I'm not so sure that they were correct. Then we had this 95% issue. They're claiming they're going to make a 95% achievement of their reduced goals. So I guess from the perspective of the mail user as well as the recipient, is it better to get something 95% of the time late than it is to get it earlier 85% of the time? What would you prefer in terms of performance? And then, okay, they have this 95% goal toward their lower standards. There are places, as you could see in the eye chart I showed you earlier, in the quarterly performance numbers, there are some locations that consistently do good, that beat the current standards. Will they continue to do so? And will, on the other end of the side of the coin, will those that stink continue to fall short? Now, there's nothing in here that affects the people, and obviously people move the mail. So if you don't have any methods or tools or strategies to improve managerial and employee performance, what's going to happen? Will they simply not make a difference? Will they simply not enable achievement of the new standards? And what happens if that happens? A good question. So going on the next slide, let's go to the other happy point here, the price change. Just to make sure you understand a probably not always obvious underpinning of this. The Postal Reform Law required the Postal Regulatory Commission to look at the rate setting system 10 years after it was enacted, which would make it 2016, and charged the PRC with looking at how that system enabled achievement of specific objectives, number 5 of which was to ensure the financial stability of the Postal Service. Obviously, the only thing that could conclude was that the Postal Service was not financially stable. Now, they were not empowered to parse out the reasons for that or to address the reasons, namely the pre-funding obligation. They were just simply told, the PRC that is, by the law, that if there wasn't enough money being generated, they have to go find other ways to do it. So that what they came up with after 3 years of rulemaking were 3 new factors. One called density, which relates as a calculation related to the loss of volume per stop. The second is retirement, which is a factor calculated to become a contribution toward the pre-funding obligation. And the third is what they call non-compensatory, a fixed 2% to improve the cost coverage of underwater products like periodicals and some flats. So the Postal Service calculated these authorities of the first 2, which they were told to do, and came up with the numbers that later manifest themselves in the rate case. Now, going on to the next slide, these are comments by the Postal Service, who frankly has had these things burning a hole in their pocket. They saw the implementation of these new authorities as an integral part of their strategy to overcome the $160 billion loss they say is going to occur in 10 years. So indifferent to what may be actually occurring, is the Postal Service losing money as badly this year as expected or not? They said they were going to be judicious and prudent to optimize their revenue chances within the new regulatory system, and that they would optimize their prices. So I have a hard time reconciling judicious and prudent and optimize our prices, because in the one case, you seem to be actually trying to think about what the consequence to your business and your customers would be. Well, in the second case, saying, screw that, I'm going to try to get all the money I can possibly get. The next slide, I think, shows you in which direction they went. You had, because of a different formula that's used for a non-annual CPI price increase, they had a little less than 1.25% from that. Plus, they had 4.5% from the density factor, a little over 1% for retirement, and of course 2% for the non-compensatory classes. So if you're looking at the total, it's just shy of 9%. And that is a huge increase. That is actually more than the total of the last 5 years price increases. And it wasn't simply a matter of a huge amount. It was also how they were spread. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Of course, even though they were told, even though the Postal Service was told this would be a problem for mailers' clients, because budgets were already set, they went forward anyways. So the obvious mathematical consequence would be, well, I got X amount of dollars, I'll just mail fewer pieces. I may send out fewer flats, which are going to be really hit hard. And the governors, when they authorized this filing, were deliberately ambiguous about whether or not they're going to stay on this annually. They're going to go back to January. Are they going to file again in January or whatever? So the price signals that are being sent to mail preparers in this case are really problematic. On the next slide, you can see how, notwithstanding their commitment to be prudent and judicious, they drained the bank. They used everything they could, the CPI, the little dribble they had from the last rate case, and everything that was available because of the PRC's increase. So they ended up with just pennies left over that would be banked towards the next increase, whatever that might be. So these are the very serious numbers you saw. But let's look and see how they spread in different situations in the next slide. This is how things look for first class, for retail first class. Excuse me. The top slide, or the top picture being the current rates, the middle picture being the proposed rates, and the bottom picture being the percent increase that those represent. Now, what you see on the screen is from our newsletter. It's from the May 31st special issue, which all of you who are subscribers got just that day. So this is a representation of how things change for retail customers. As you can see, stamps, the stamp went from 55 to 58, which is about 5.5%. But some machinable things went up a lot more. You can see the red letters, the bright red letters, where some rate cells went up in the mid-teens. Flats got a big hit, particularly the lighter weight flats. Heavier flats had a lesser increase, which in some ways is kind of counterintuitive. The metered mail got less of an increase than stamp mail because the Postal Service believes such mail is more efficient. Well, obviously, it avoids the cancellation process. Whether the cancellation process is worth the difference in price is another question. The next slide goes into the pre-sort sides of first class, and again, you can see how there was a very different outcome from the price changes. For one thing, going from the top to the middle section, you can see there's some new pre-sort levels, some pricing levels that were introduced within machinable and non-machinable non-automation mail. And one of the curious things is that if you look at the middle slide, the automation AADC price is the same as the non-automation AADC price. And of course, they're both pre-sorted, but there's going to be some question in some originators and ratepayers' minds about, well, wait a minute, if I'm paying the same price for simply machinable mail as I am for automated mail, then are there some additional costs that I would have to absorb to become automation that I could avoid by simply staying machinable? These are all things that may become unintended consequences of the price change. Meanwhile, in the non-machinable area, where you had it split out from the single, what was or is 66-cent price, you've now got a spread from 58.6 to 79.4, depending on pre-sort level. And what that means is you've got some pieces that are more finely pre-sort getting a nice decrease in price, while those that are being sent at the mixed ADC level have a huge increase. We talked about the price for flats changing, and just as we saw in retail, the biggest hits are going to the lighter weight pieces, the more finely lighter weight pieces, which seems to be counterintuitive. But you look at the less finely sorted pieces that are heavier, and they're getting a price increase that is a fraction of the increase being given to the 5-digit lighter weight pieces. So the message there is one that I guess I've got to figure out, because I don't see anything very obvious. The gap on the next slide, the gap between 5-digit and AADC grows by half a cent, and it grows in AADC and mixed AADC as well. But the circle shows what we were talking about, how the same price exists now for the same pre-sort level in two different types of mail: automation and just machinable. And in each case, the net price reflects a significantly different change over the current price. Automation mail gets an increase of well up towards 8%, whereas the machinable mail sees a price increase of well less than 1%. So again, go figure. This is one of those situations where the Postal Service may be sending a price signal that it doesn't want to send. Going on to the next slide, we'll repeat the exercise here for marketing mail. Now, the top, this is a little bit busier, I realize. Above the top dotted line is for letters, carrier automation letters. The middle is for the same thing for the proposed prices, and the bottom section with the color shows you how much those are increasing. Basic pre-sort is apparently not as valuable to the Postal Service as it once was, so they're not discouraging it in favor of more finely pre-sorted pieces, even though those finer levels are themselves getting some significant increase in price. And oddly, the proportion of increase is more serious on the right-hand side, which are the nonprofit rates. So, for example, the basic level there is going up from 12 to 13%, whereas the nonprofit for the same thing is going up from 17 to 19%. So there's an issue there. Of course, the prices for nonprofit are set to be about 60% of the commercial prices, the contribution is. So this could be simply a mathematical adjustment, but even so, the change is going to be pretty meaningful to those companies that use nonprofit rates to get contributions, for example. On the next slide, looking at lighter weight flats, you can see how those prices are changed. Again, I don't see an awful lot of green down there. Nothing's going down, but the basic prices are going up again by significant amounts. High density has been subdivided to be on and the price is based on whether it's on a 5-digit pallet or another pallet of some other pre-sort. So you can see that the worst increase of the two, or the worst change in price for the two types of pallet was for those that are not 5-digit. And again, as we saw earlier, the less fine levels of pre-sort are those that are seeing larger increases. And on the right-hand side, in the pink highlighted bold red numbers, there are some scary figures for nonprofit high-density mail on a not 5-digit pallet. So these are all some significant hits that are going to be hard for companies to absorb. Going on to the next slide, you can see how this continues. All of these numbers are increases. Some are maybe 5% in that neighborhood. But if you go to the piece rates, which are the ones in the leftmost column, you can see some big increases, particularly as we discussed on the less finely pre-sorted levels of carrier route. Oddly enough, the piece rate for the nonprofit 5-digit automation rate, which is down toward the bottom of your screen, is going up almost 36%, that individual rate cell. Now, the overall application of the cap, of course, is at the class level. So this is an example of when the averaging, the homogenization at the class level really hides some of the changes that are occurring in specific rate cells that are very significant to the customers who use that rate cell. Going on to the next slide, there were some changes to periodicals. Of course, they got the 2% bump on top of everything else because they're underwater. And there were some changes to the zoned rates that really resulted in some odd circumstances. These are all reflected in the charts in the May 31st special issue that you got. What's also in there, of course, is information about bound printed matter and about media mail and library mail that were included in that 2% increase. Changes for mail, especially because of, again, they're underwater. So now to the next slide. What's the process? Well, the Postal Service filed this at the end of May, and the comment period is at the end of this month in about 10 days. The PRC's decision is required 21 days thereafter, which would be July 19th. So the Postal Service is planning on implementing it on August 29th. That's been the date that they have that they announced when they first filed this case. There's been no word yet on competitive products, so they have not said that they would raise those prices as they usually would do at the same time as the market dominant increase. So we don't know what's happening there. But there's a couple of wild cards here. Obviously, congressional action is always a wild card. Are they going to step in somehow and say, you cannot do this because it's a dumb idea? They wouldn't say it's a dumb idea, even if it were. But they're not going to. They can't do that. But what could they do? We don't know. But there's also this thing in the Court of Appeals. The Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers and a couple of other groups had filed suit last year after the PRC issued its final rule that introduced the three factors we talked about earlier: the density, retirement, and non-compensatory factors. And the suit basically says that the commission overextended its authority. They didn't have the authority to do what it did. And that suit is still in the Court of Appeals. So the questions come up of what happens if the court decides the case while this is going on. Well, if they support the Postal Service, nothing happens. Everything goes on as it's now occurring. However, if the court sides with the plaintiffs, then it could be sent back to the commission to say what you did was excessive. You couldn't do it. Do something different. And if the case has not been concluded, that effectively, vitiates any kind of authority the Postal Service would have used in the filing. If the filing if it's approved by the PRC and implemented in August, and the court comes back, let's say in September, unfortunately, any rates that have been paid in the interim would not be refunded. Although there would definitely be some requirement to reset prices back to where they were, pending a refiling of the case under whatever the PRC might do to authorize higher prices in the future. So that's a real wild card to keep an eye on. Moving on to the next slide, you can see that the governors have not been particularly useful. They've considered what they're doing more rational pricing. Somehow or other, DeJoy's comment has stuck in their heads that last year ratepayers paid X for services that cost Y, without looking at the fact that some of the things that drove costs higher than what prices were covering were not things having to do directly with mail service. The pre-funding obligation, various other retirement obligations, and of course the workers' comp variability all have a huge impact from time to time on Postal Service finances, and that's not necessarily the cost of delivering mail. So the rationality for pricing to which the governors are referring here is something which you could take with a grain of salt. Then they've determined to go to an August timeline this year, but as it says there in the bold, they have not yet decided what they're going to do in the future, which is really not fair to ratepayers, to the companies to the clients of mail producing companies, or to anybody else in this business who's trying to find some kind of stability. So, who knows what's going to happen? They could file again in October, but it wouldn't be worthwhile. The CPI cap would only be based on 3-4 months, and the new authorities that were used for the majority of the current proposal wouldn't be available again until next year. They'll be recalculated again in December, but they're annualized things, and they can't be provided for the Postal Service to use until 22. So what they're going to do in the future is deliberately ambiguous, which is no help at all. Going on to the next slide, there are some questions that have been asked. Is the price increase really necessary? Earlier in the program here, you saw the April numbers. The Postal Service had lost money. They were not in the black for the year to date, but they were way short of where they were last year to date, and they are not on a pace to lose the $9 billion, $9 billion with a B, that they were supposed to lose this year if the $160 billion loss has to come to fruition. So, what happens does that mean it's still essential to raise prices in the middle of August? What would have been the real risk of waiting until August? Waiting until August to file, that is, for an October increase. They would have had the full benefit of the full 1 year CPI cap, which has been going up in the past few months. So they got a little more money there. Would they have lost that much more between now and then? And what happens if all these financial forecasts don't decline as proposed? We need all this money because we're going to lose $160 billion. What happens if we're not really losing that kind of money? What happens if things don't go down by the bow as planned? What happens if Congress passes legislation that ends the pre-funding obligation, that moves postal workers into Medicare, that gets them out of their current health plans? What happens if those significant cost reductions come into play? Is the $160 billion bogey going to be held up there still as a target for revenue increases? And what happens if the court rules against the PRC? What happens if that underpinning of the new authorities for the Postal Service's rates is knocked out? What happens then? There's a lot that can happen here that could prove the DeJoy plan to be, let's say, is not as prudent and judicious as he would have us believe. So on the last slide, you can see that there are things you need to turn to for information of what's going on. The Postal Service has its Postal Pro and a variety of publications, and of course the Federal Register notices. But I'd like to think that what we provide to you, both on webinars like this and through Mailer Sub News, give you the current information that you need. So as much as we can provide it to you, the essential thing is for you to actually read it. Now, if we are not whitelisted on your email servers, we could be ending up in your spam filter. Or if we're getting through that and we end up in your mail and you don't open the publication and read it, then you're missing out on what's going on. And something you miss, some little kernel in page 12, could be just the thing that you need to know, but you'll miss it, so you have a problem. The point is, stay informed. That's the important thing, because being informed gives you a better chance of optimizing a bad situation than not. So last slide, questions. Unfortunately, I still can't see anything that's being shown to you. So Michelle, could you read the questions off to me if you can see them?
I sure can. Looking back here, I think our first question we had a little earlier when you were addressing service standards was asked, these standards are for first class or for standard mail?
All of these service standard changes refer to first class and time-sensitive periodicals. But that does not mean that it won't also have in it that the system and network changes will still have a consequence on all classes of mail.
Okay, thank you. One more here. Actually, we got a couple more, but the next one, please talk about the logic for offering high density rates. Were you able to hear the question okay?
No, I didn't.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so if you could please talk about the logic for offering high density rates.
High density rates are supposed to reflect the efficiency of having more volume. It's the pre-sort notion. It's work area. High density is supposed to be giving you a volume that is almost capable of supporting a third bundle. And a third bundle meaning something that the carrier can carry separate from the usual DPS letters and DPS flats. It's not always integrated by automated processing into the other streams, if you will, into letters or flats. So avoiding some sort of handling and pre-sort is what justifies that count.
Okay, so for our next question,
what else?
Where is the Postal Service going to find the extra truck drivers to move the additional mail by truck? At MTAC, it was presented that there was a driver shortage to the tune of 80,000 drivers in 2020.
That's a real good question. That is one that the Postal Service has really said very little about. In the interrogatories that we filed, we focused on their contention that their vehicles are underutilized. They're only 45% full. Their goal is to get them to be 65% full. But even so, all they use are 53-foot trailers, and they fill the trailers with what do they call them, pie cars. It's a container that carries trays. It isn't. They don't do bed loading. So you're going to have all these large trailers going around that are going to be 45, 55, 60% full. They're not using smaller trucks, even when the smaller trucks might enable taking volumes between point to point and avoiding transfers, because they just don't do that. But with all these trucks, even with the reduced number of trips they want to use, they have not said a word about where they're going to find the vehicles, or find the contractors to supply the drivers, or where those contractors are going to find the people to actually sit in the cab and drive the mail. So they've been very quiet about how their plan is, or what their plan is, if they got a plan to address the driver shortage. They're going to have all this wonderful transportation, I guess, but hopefully you need somebody to drive the truck, and I don't know where they're getting them from.
Okay, let's see here. I do have a couple more questions here. One more here. Any feel for if the rate increase request will be approved or get kicked back? I feel that it may already be a done deal and approved.
Well, unfortunately, there is no statutory factor for common sense. As we talked about in the advisory opinion on service standard changes, no matter what the PRC may think of this, the PRC's opinion is an advisory opinion. They've gotten over 470 statements from citizens. I don't know who's driving them, but these are just ordinary people writing in saying, don't do it, it's a bad idea. Nonetheless, the Postal Service has the authority to go forward on service standards on its own, and they have virtually said in so many words that they're going to do it. On the price change issue, the PRC has a little more of a real role, but even there, while they can check to make sure that the legal requirements are met, that the work papers are all correct, that all the math works, and that all the things that are supposed to be in place for statutory compliance are there, if they consider the Postal Service's decision a stupid idea from a business perspective, they can't say that they're not empowered to authorize the business wisdom of the Postal Service's case. So if the Postal Service files a case that is, as this one, 8.8% in some situations, or even higher in some rate cells, even if it's a bad idea, it's going to hurt business, it's going to drive away volume, it's going to discourage the use of the mail. If the filing is technically and legally correct, the PRC has no choice but to approve it, and it seems to be that's the way it's going.
All right then. Well, do still have a couple more questions. What do you think the standard delivery, and I believe the delivery standards will be for nonprofit mail?
Nonprofit delivery standards are the same as for commercial. For the past couple of years, marketing mail standards been, I think, 91%. But I don't know how, and that's been something they've achieved for the most part for letters, be it nonprofit or commercial rate letters. Flats have been a problem, of course, for anybody. Carrier routes been usually pretty good, but I take it back. There were some changes that were considered by the governors, and those were set in place in early May, and those reflected not what the Postal Service would like to do, but basically what they've been doing. So they had significantly lower numbers for as service standards. I don't have those in front of me, but they were in the newsletter. I remember we put them in the newsletter, I think last issue, noting the irony of having fiscal 21 service standards set in the middle of the year. But they were not impressive challenges. They were consistent with the approach consistent with the approach that's been taken on the service standard filing, of saying not what we want, not what we hope to achieve, but actually what we are achieving. So that becomes our goal.
Okay, real
What else you
quick,
got?
it looks like I've got a little input here from Tom Glassman, so I'm going to unmute Tom for just a moment, if that's okay.
Okay, Mr. Glassman.
Thank you.
What you got, Tom?
So part of the structural change is the elimination of the NDC, which they're turning into parcel processing centers, better known as RDC for Regional Distribution Center, and they're going to be opening up STCs to transfer the mail. So when we talk about potential delays or elongation of the delivery schedule for marketing mail, I'm willing to put money down that we're going to see an issue on NDC dropped mail until they get their act together. Because it's going to be difficult to open all these new facilities and continue to handle the mail in a timely fashion. And that's just a projection or a prediction from my crystal ball.
Well, Tom, I can't argue with your crystal ball. I think you've got a lot going on right now. Facility realignments. There are some that have been announced to resume from the 2015 list. You've got the NDC, STC issues. They're opening more STCs. You have ongoing transportation issues, as we discussed a minute ago, because of driver shortages. You've got realignments of internal operating plans being conducted, I guess, nationwide to support the change in service standards. You've got people moving around, organizational structure changes that have been going on since last year. And you've got, of course, the results of early retirements being offered and the change in management structure at the district and area levels. So between equipment and facility and buildings and transportation and people and processes, there's a lot that has to be put in place, not vetted, but just, taken around the block once if it works, and then made efficient and operating as planned between now and when the holiday mailing season and the holiday package season start in not that many months. So yeah, I agree. It's going to be the crystal ball. Your crystal ball is not wrong. Shell, anything else?
Oh, yes. So just to follow up on the nonprofit question from a moment ago, we're looking for the number of days. I think we're looking for the service standard, like the changes, if there are going to be any changes to that.
The service standard for marketing mail is the same regardless of whether it's nonprofit or commercial. And again, I could dig around here while I'm sitting here and look for the issue in which we ran the belatedly announced service standards for marketing mail, but I don't have that in front of me. But if you find that number, and again, it was in the recent issue of the newsletter, in the past issue or two, that would apply to both nonprofit and marketing because they move through the same mail streams. Treatment of processing and delivery do not differentiate between commercial and nonprofit rate marketing mail.
Okay, thank you. So let's see here. Do a couple more. As a follow-up to the ground transportation switch, how do they plan on dealing with weather impacts? Air transportation is easily rerouted, ground not so much, specifically winter weather events and trucks getting snowed in.
Another good question. Well, I guess you don't have a driver to move the truck; it's not a problem. But if you do have a driver and the truck is stuck in a traffic jam or a snowstorm or other delays, and as a result misses a connection at an STC, of course, because it has to do all this transferring, or gets to a processing facility late, you're going to have a delay, and that's not going to be something which is any different than what it is right now. Of course, the Postal Service's whole complaint is that air transportation is so unreliable, and they've had figures showing that percentage to percentage for quite a while for air transportation falls short in supporting service compared to trucks. Well, that of course is under the current scenario. How it's going to play out in the future when you have less air transportation and more trucking capacity, more ground capacity, and you begin to have the weather impacts that you just mentioned, we'll see how those numbers may change. Obviously, if you're driving from New York to Albany, you're not going to fly the mail that distance. So, but if you're going to try to move the mail from New York to Denver, and there's going to be a number of stops, then you increase the numbers of opportunity, the chances for delay proportionally. Things going from New York to LA may still fly, and I'm sure you're still going to have capacity issues because the airlines still may not have all the lift they need to move mail as well as the bags that passengers bring along. And the two primary carriers for the Postal Service, air carriers, FedEx and UPS, they're pretty busy with their own stuff right now. So, as DeJoy once said, we don't have our own air fleet. Well, that means you may have to find other ways to make up for that and still maintain the service that air transportation provides, instead of just throwing up your hands and saying we're going to put it all on the ground, because that inevitably will lead to delays and, of course, weather delays and traffic accidents and such. So there's no guarantee that you won't have similar problems on the ground compared to those that are being experienced in the air transportation.
Okay, so another question related to transportation. Do you think the PMG proposed transporting mail via surface versus air, because his business will be a significant benefactor, as his business has already moved bulk of the U.S. mail?
I think his inclination is to prefer ground transportation for two reasons. He knows it, and it's less expensive. He knows how to move stuff on the ground because of his prior professional life. I don't think that experience necessarily involved moving something like mail, who has a different customer profile than would boxes of toilet cleaner. So there's a different situation there. He doesn't like air transportation because on its face, it's less reliable. And the numbers seem to support him on their face, even though, even a little bit of delay in the air can be more than made up once you get off the ground and into the air. I mean, anybody who travels by air knows that can be true. To the best of my knowledge, he does no longer own any financial any component of a trucking business. He had one, he sold it. He did quite well, but I don't think he has, aside from what he may have divested himself of to become PMG, I don't think there was an interest that he would now be unfairly advancing by his preference for ground transportation. So this may be a bad idea, but I don't think it's one that has any kind of legal or ethical component to it.
All right, so I think this will be the last question, and it's just a clarification. Please elaborate. Are they closing NDCs? Does this mean we also lose that discount?
No, and I don't know. No, the former BMCs, later NDCs, are being repurposed now to move packages. And the future of the NDC discount, which was something that was actually asked about in the interrogatories related to the service standard change, remains somewhat ambiguous because the answer was there's nothing going on about changing discounts. That doesn't mean that the discount is still being earned by bringing marketing mail to an NDC. That doesn't mean the discount is not going to change. It doesn't mean the value of it won't change. It doesn't mean a lot of things. So it doesn't really answer the question of what the future of any discount could be. Are we going to have an STC discount versus an SCF discount? Are we going to get rid of the NDC discount for marketing mail, but keep it for bound printed matter, which is typically a package? I don't know. The repurposing of the NDCs is part of the plan. I didn't have a slide in this way, but there was a slide that was elsewhere in the plan that showed how they have two different systems now, almost two different flows for packages and for marketing mail. So how those changes and flows are going to affect the appropriateness and application of destination entry discounts is a very good question. Right now they're not changing anything, but obviously if you predicated your discounts upon a certain type of processing network and that network changes, then the obvious question is, well, are my discounts going to change? And they haven't been particularly forthcoming in explaining that. So they're not helpful.
Okay, so one little follow-up to that here as we close in on 2 o'clock, and it's related to what we just answered. Just asking where the letter size mail will go for these discounts, if we have an answer for that yet.
Well, if you've got marketing mail letters that are looking for an NDC discount, I would continue to bring them there, but I'm sure there will be distribution list changes or the usual type of, the labeling list changes forthcoming to implement whatever processing network changes are going to be made between now and September. And then we'll find out where that mail is supposed to go. Right now, as I said, there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of unanswered questions. And those would include, of course, how will I be able to earn my discount? Everybody who is a commercial mailer, I'm sure, has contracts with carriers to move their mail downstream for destination entry. So now they're going to have to work with those carriers on a different matrix of entry points. And we collectively have not been given a lot of information with which to plan such adjustments. And that's just the way the Postal Service has been. They're not forthcoming about that.
All right, that wraps up the questions for this afternoon.
Great, thanks. Now, I guess in closing, I just want to make sure that I thank everybody. I want to thank Michelle, of course, for being able to be there when I suddenly went off the air. And I want to thank you for your patience as we went through a little bit of a technical challenge there. Again, a reminder, we're going to be back on our regular webinar schedule. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be revisiting the privacy laws and the state sales tax and use laws that are still issues for another thing for us to worry about. And we'll be keeping you posted on what's going on with the service standard changes and the rate changes in the regular issues of our newsletter. The next one being next Monday. So we look forward to having you look at that. But again, stay informed. That's the important thing. And make sure that you know what's happening, because otherwise you could be in the wrong place and not be able to make the best decisions for your businesses or your clients. So again, thank you very much for calling in today. Thanks again, Michelle. And hopefully we'll be talking to all of you soon on the next webinar. Bye.